What would you do if you found 4 helpless bear cubs crying in the wilderness, their mother nowhere to be found? Most people would call wildlife services and walk away. But one 67-year-old woman made a choice that would change not only the lives of these cubs, but her own destiny in ways she could never have imagined. What happened years later will restore your faith in the unbreakable bond between humans and nature. Before we start, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications to catch more heartwarming stories like this one. It was a crisp October morning in the mountains of Montana when Eleanor Patterson decided to take what she thought would be her final hike. At 67, with arthritis creeping into her joints and her late husband's voice still echoing in her empty house, Eleanor had been contemplating whether life still held any meaningful chapters for her. The golden aspens whispered overhead as she walked the familiar trail she and her husband Robert had explored together for 37 years of marriage. Each step felt heavier than the last, not from physical exhaustion, but from the weight of loneliness that had settled over her life like morning fog. But then she heard it, a sound that stopped her cold. Crying. Not human crying, but something that tugged at her heart just the same. High-pitched whimpers echoing through the forest, desperate and afraid. Eleanor's maternal instincts, dormant since her own children had grown up and moved away, suddenly sparked to life. Following the sound deeper into the woods, Eleanor pushed through a thicket of mountain laurel and froze at what she saw. 4 tiny black bear cubs, no bigger than house cats, huddled together in a small clearing. Their eyes were barely open, their fur matted and dirty. They were crying for their mother, who was nowhere to be seen. Eleanor's first instinct was to back away slowly. She knew the cardinal rule of the wilderness: never get between a mother bear and her cubs. But as minutes turned to an hour, and the hour stretched into 2, it became painfully clear that these babies were alone, truly alone. Eleanor knelt at the edge of the clearing, her heart breaking as she watched the cubs stumble over each other, searching desperately for warmth and comfort. The smallest one, a little female with a distinctive white patch on her chest, seemed to be failing. Her cries were getting weaker, her movements more sluggish. "What am I supposed to do?" Eleanor whispered to herself, thinking of Robert. He would have known what to do. He always knew what to do. As a retired veterinary technician, Eleanor understood that these cubs were maybe only a few weeks old. Without their mother's milk and warmth, they wouldn't survive another night in the dropping temperatures. The responsible thing to do would be to call the wildlife authorities and let nature take its course. But as she watched the smallest cub collapse from exhaustion, something inside Eleanor made the decision for her. She couldn't just walk away. Carefully, she approached the cubs, speaking in soft, soothing tones. "It's okay, babies. It's okay." The cubs, desperate for any source of comfort, didn't run. Instead, they crawled toward her voice, their tiny paws reaching out. Eleanor gathered the cubs in her jacket, feeling their tiny hearts beating rapidly against her chest. The smallest one, the little female she would later name Hope, barely had the strength to lift her head. Eleanor knew she was taking an enormous risk. Caring for orphaned bear cubs was illegal without proper permits. If caught, she could face serious charges. But looking down at these helpless creatures, legal consequences seemed meaningless. The journey home was a blur of careful steps and whispered promises. Eleanor's small cabin, once filled with the laughter of her children and grandchildren during summer visits, suddenly felt alive again with purpose. She cleared out the spare bedroom, laying down old blankets and towels, creating a makeshift den for her unexpected guests. The first few weeks were the hardest of Eleanor's life. The cubs needed feeding every 2 hours, around the clock. Eleanor researched everything she could about bear cub nutrition, mixing special formulas and feeding them with baby bottles. She named them Hope, Faith, Courage, and Spirit, names that reflected not just her wishes for them, but what they had given back to her. Sleep became a luxury Eleanor couldn't afford. Dark circles formed under her eyes, and her arthritic hands ached from the constant feeding and cleaning. There were moments, usually at 3 a.m., when all 4 cubs were crying and she could barely stand from exhaustion, when Eleanor wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. Hope, the smallest cub, nearly died twice in those first few weeks. Eleanor spent entire nights holding her, keeping her warm with her own body heat, willing the tiny creature to keep fighting. During the worst night, when Hope's breathing became so shallow Eleanor could barely detect it, she found herself praying for the first time since Robert's funeral. "Please," she whispered into the darkness, tears streaming down her face, "don't let me lose her too." Slowly, miraculously, the cubs began to thrive. Hope's appetite returned with a vengeance, and soon she was demanding bottles as loudly as her siblings. Faith, the largest of the 4, appointed herself the protector, always positioning herself between her siblings and any perceived danger. Courage, true to his name, was the first to explore beyond their makeshift den, while Spirit seemed to understand Eleanor's moods and would curl up next to her whenever she seemed sad. As spring arrived, the cubs grew larger and more adventurous. Eleanor's small cabin became too confining, so she built an outdoor enclosure in her backyard. She watched with maternal pride as they learned to climb and wrestle and play. Their antics brought laughter back into her life in a way she hadn't experienced since Robert's passing. But Eleanor knew this arrangement couldn't last forever. The cubs were growing rapidly, and soon they would need to return to the wild where they belonged. The thought of letting them go broke her heart, but she understood that true love sometimes means letting go. As summer progressed, Eleanor began taking the cubs on longer and longer walks into the forest, teaching them to forage for berries, insects, and roots. She showed them how to fish in the stream behind her property and how to recognize dangerous plants and animals. Without realizing it, Eleanor was becoming the mother bear these cubs had lost. Local wildlife officials eventually learned about Eleanor's situation through a concerned neighbor. Instead of the arrest Eleanor expected, she found herself working with Dr. Sarah Collins, a wildlife biologist who was amazed at how healthy and well-socialized the cubs had become under Eleanor's care. "In 30 years of wildlife rehabilitation, I've never seen orphan cubs this well-adjusted. You've done something remarkable here." Together, they developed a plan for gradually transitioning the cubs back to the wild. Eleanor's property, which bordered thousands of acres of national forest, became the perfect staging ground for their return to nature. The process of saying goodbye was harder than Eleanor had imagined. One by one, over the course of several weeks, the cubs began venturing further into the forest, returning less and less frequently to Eleanor's cabin. Faith was the first to leave permanently, her protective instincts drawing her to establish her own territory. Courage followed soon after, his adventurous spirit calling him deeper into the mountains. Spirit seemed to stay longer than the others, seeming to sense Eleanor's loneliness, but eventually, even she felt the call of the wild and disappeared into the forest one crisp September morning, exactly 1 year after Eleanor had first found them. Hope was the last to leave. The tiny cub who had nearly died in Eleanor's arms was now a healthy young bear, but she seemed reluctant to abandon the woman who had saved her life. For weeks, she would venture into the forest during the day, but return each evening to sleep near Eleanor's cabin. "You have to go, sweetheart," she would tell her, fighting back tears. "This isn't your world anymore." Finally,
On a golden October day that reminded Eleanor of the morning she had first found them, Hope touched her nose to Eleanor's hand one last time and walked into the forest. Eleanor watched until she disappeared among the aspens, then sat on her porch and cried, for joy, for loss, for the empty cabin that awaited her, and for the year that had changed her life forever. The first winter after the cubs left was the hardest. Eleanor found herself listening for sounds that never came, preparing food for mouths that were no longer there to feed. The silence felt overwhelming, and the loneliness returned with a vengeance. But then, on a snowy February morning, Eleanor looked out her kitchen window and gasped. 4 sets of tracks led from the forest to her porch. Large paw prints, adult bear prints, and there, sitting calmly by her back door as if no time had passed at all, was Hope. She was magnificent. No longer the tiny, failing cub Eleanor had rescued, but a beautiful adult female bear with glossy black fur and intelligent, familiar eyes. The white patch on her chest had grown with her, now a distinctive marking that made her instantly recognizable. Eleanor stepped onto her porch, hardly daring to breathe. "Hope?" she whispered. The bear looked up at her with what Eleanor could swear was recognition, even affection. She approached slowly, and to Eleanor's amazement, gently touched her massive head against Eleanor's outstretched hand. For several minutes they stood together in the falling snow, the old woman who had given everything to save a life, and the bear who had grown up to become magnificent and wild, yet had never forgotten the love that saved her. That visit wasn't the end, it was the beginning of something even more extraordinary. Over the following months, Hope began visiting regularly, sometimes alone, sometimes with her siblings who had also grown into healthy adult bears. They would appear at the edge of Eleanor's property, never threatening, always respectful of the boundary between wild and domestic life. But the most incredible moment came 2 springs later, when Hope appeared at Eleanor's cabin with 2 tiny cubs of her own. Eleanor watched in wonder as Hope gently led her babies onto the porch, as if presenting them to their honorary grandmother. The cubs, curious and playful, tumbled over each other, while Hope sat calmly beside Eleanor, a living bridge between 2 worlds. "She's showing me her children," Eleanor whispered to Dr. Collins, who had arrived to document this unprecedented behavior. "She's sharing her family with me." Word of Eleanor's extraordinary relationship with the bears spread throughout the wildlife community. Researchers came from universities across the country to study this unique bond between human and bear. Eleanor's cabin became an unofficial research station where scientists could observe natural bear behavior in a way that had never been possible before. But for Eleanor, the scientific importance paled in comparison to the personal miracle. The empty nest that had once echoed with loneliness was now filled with purpose. She had become a grandmother, not just to human grandchildren who visited in summer, but to generations of bears who continued to acknowledge her as family. Hope's cubs grew and eventually left to start families of their own, but they too remembered the old woman who had loved their mother. Eleanor's property became a way station of sorts, a place where wild bears would pause in their journeys, touching base with the human who had become part of their extended family story. Faith eventually appeared with cubs of her own, as did Courage and Spirit. Eleanor found herself the matriarch of an entire bear family tree, each generation taught by their mothers to respect and trust the old woman in the cabin. Now 73, Eleanor no longer takes long hikes into the mountains, but she doesn't need to. The mountains come to her in the form of the bears who continue to visit, to show their children, to maintain the bond that began with 4 tiny cubs and one woman brave enough to answer their call for help. Eleanor's life had come full circle in a way she never could have imagined. The woman who had felt useless and forgotten discovered that she had become something extraordinary, a bridge between the human and natural worlds, a living example of what's possible when compassion overcomes fear. Her story attracted the attention of wildlife organizations worldwide. She began speaking at conferences, sharing her insights about bear behavior and the importance of coexistence with wildlife. Her small cabin became an unofficial research station where scientists could observe natural bear behavior in a way that had never been possible before. But for Eleanor, the profound change was in Eleanor herself. The depression and purposelessness that had plagued her after Robert's death were replaced by a deep sense of fulfillment. She had discovered that life's most meaningful chapters often begin when we think the story is ending. "I thought I was saving them," Eleanor often tells visitors, watching Hope's latest litter play in the meadow beyond her cabin. "But really, they saved me." Today, Eleanor's bear family spans 3 generations. Hope, now a mature matriarch herself, still visits regularly, often bringing her latest cubs to meet their honorary grandmother. The white patch on her chest has faded slightly with age, but her eyes still hold the same intelligence and affection that Eleanor recognized that snowy February morning years ago. Eleanor has established the Second Chances Wildlife Foundation on her property, working with universities and wildlife organizations to study bear behavior and promote coexistence between humans and wildlife. Her research has contributed to new policies that better protect bear families while keeping both humans and animals safe. The cabin that once echoed with loneliness now hosts a steady stream of researchers, wildlife photographers, and bear enthusiasts from around the world. Eleanor has written a book about her experiences, with all proceeds going to wildlife conservation efforts. But the real magic happens in the quiet moments, when Eleanor sits on her porch in the evening, watching Hope's cubs play in the meadow, knowing that her choice to help 4 tiny, helpless creatures has rippled outward to create something beautiful and lasting. Eleanor often thinks about that October morning when she almost took her final hike, feeling like her useful life was behind her. She realizes now that sometimes our greatest adventures, our most important chapters, begin when we least expect them. All it takes is the courage to answer when life calls for help.
The bears taught Eleanor that family isn't just about blood relations. It's about love, care, and showing up when someone needs you most. They taught her that it's never too late for a new beginning, never too late to make a difference, never too late to discover that your life has purpose and meaning beyond anything you ever imagined. Eleanor's story reminds us that extraordinary moments often come disguised as ordinary days. That morning in the forest, she could have walked past those crying cubs. She could have told herself it wasn't her problem. that she was too old, too tired, too set in her ways to take on such a massive responsibility. Instead, she chose compassion over convenience, love over logic, and hope over fear. Her story challenges us to consider what calls for help are we walking past in our own lives? What opportunities for connection and purpose are we missing because they seem too difficult, too risky, or too outside our comfort zones? Eleanor's bears didn't just survive, they thrived, creating families of their own that continued to honor the woman who gave them a chance at life. Her choice to help didn't just save 4 cubs. It created a legacy of love and connection that spans generations. Sometimes the most profound act of saving someone else is actually saving ourselves. Eleanor thought she was giving those cubs a future, but they were giving her one too. They reminded her that life always offers second chances, new chapters, and opportunities for meaning, no matter our age, no matter our circumstances. The next time you encounter someone or something in need, remember Eleanor and her bears. Remember that your act of compassion might not just change a life. It might change the world, one small kindness at a time. Because in the end, we are all connected, human and animal, young and old, lost and found. Eleanor's story is proof that when we open our hearts to help others, we often discover that we are the ones being rescued. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs a reminder that it's never too late for extraordinary things to happen. Like this video if you believe in the power of compassion. Subscribe for more heartwarming stories like this one, and tell us in the comments what act of kindness changed your life. Remember, your next chapter might be your greatest chapter. Stay open to the magic.